Flight crew ignores black woman until they learn she's an undercover aviation safety inspector. The bustling terminal hummed with impatient footsteps, suitcases rumbling along polished floors, and muffled announcements echoing overhead. Among the sea of travelers stood a poised, confident woman, quietly observing the flurry of activity around her. Her gaze swept across faces and uniforms as though she saw things no one else could. She didn't fit the stereotype of a person wielding power or authority, but she possessed both. The tension clung to her shoulders because this was no ordinary trip. If only the flight crew knew what she carried in her slim leather folder, they might have paid attention. Instead, she remained invisible until everything changed. Monique Carter stood in line at gate B29, waiting to board Jetstream Air Flight 762, a Boeing 737 bound for Chicago O'Hare International Airport. She was dressed in a simple navy blue blazer, matching pants, and low-heeled black pumps. Her hair was pulled back in a neat chignon that looked practical, though she had styled it with a refined grace. She tapped her boarding pass lightly against her palm, looking around at the crowd of passengers' families, corralled by parents with anxious eyes, business travelers talking into phones and adjusting ties, and vacationers wearing bright shirts that hinted at excitement for new adventures. No one would suspect Monique was anything more than just another passenger on this crowded flight. The crispness of her attire might suggest she was traveling for business, but her demeanor was unassuming. She gave polite nods to those who bumped her or mumbled apologies as they maneuvered through the line. Inside, her senses were alert, trained to notice every detail: the location of the exit gates, the flight attendants' expressions, the cleanliness of the seats in the waiting area. Sometimes, just a few clues could reveal an airline's overall attitude towards safety and service. Monique had been assigned by the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) to conduct an undercover assessment of Jetstream Air. While the airline had a decent track record in maintenance and timely flights, there were rumblings, complaints piling up quietly, rumors of questionable treatment of certain passengers, staff morale issues, and questionable compliance with safety drills. It was enough to warrant a covert inspection, and Monique's presence was the key to verifying these concerns. As she approached the boarding door, she felt the scrutiny of the flight attendants scanning tickets. She offered a calm smile and handed over her pass. The first flight attendant, a tall woman named Laura, forced a quick, perfunctory grin that never reached her eyes. Laura's eyes shifted away almost instantly, focusing on the next passenger behind Monique. Monique quietly noted the behavior. No warm greeting, no effort to establish any rapport. This might have been standard, or might have been a clue. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, so she simply walked down the jet bridge and onto the plane. The cabin was arranged in a 3-3-seat configuration, typical for a Boeing 737. Monique had seat 12A, a window seat just behind the wing. She found her seat, stored her carry-on in the overhead bin, and sat down. Immediately she noticed a faint layer of dust on the window's inner frame and a stain on the seat cushion. Minor details, but she mentally catalogued them. Cleanliness, after all, was part of an airline's brand and indicated the thoroughness of ground crew practices. Next to her sat a middle-aged woman wearing a floral print blouse and reading a travel magazine. She glanced up and offered a friendly smile. "Headed to Chicago for business or pleasure?" the woman asked. "Business," Monique responded with a gentle nod. She had perfected the art of giving minimal personal information while never coming off as rude or aloof. The overhead bin slammed shut abruptly as another passenger struggled to fit his oversized roller bag into the cramped space. 2 rows ahead, a mother tried to quiet an infant who was starting to fuss. Monique sensed a ripple of tension in the cabin, a typical full flight, with travelers wondering if they'd leave on time. Looking down the aisle, she noticed the lead flight attendant, a tall, slender man with neatly combed hair and a polished demeanor. His name tag read Nigel. He was giving final instructions to a younger attendant who had worry lines etched on her brow. Monique watched them briefly, noting the way Nigel frowned and shook his head. Whatever the younger attendant had asked, the answer was apparently negative. She looked away, appearing uncertain. This seemed unremarkable at first, just typical pre-flight stress. But Monique felt a nagging sense that the tension ran deeper. She reminded herself to maintain objectivity. Her job was to observe and only take official action if passenger safety was compromised or there was evidence of regulatory violations. Once everyone was seated, Nigel took the intercom and welcomed passengers aboard, reciting the standard script about the flight time, cruising altitude, and weather conditions. Monique listened carefully, noting that his tone was polite but perfunctory. He seemed to rattle off the instructions with little warmth or genuine concern. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the cabin lights dimmed momentarily. The safety demonstration began. Laura demonstrated how to fasten the seatbelt, how to use the oxygen mask, and pointed out the exits. Monique couldn't help but notice that the demonstration was rushed. The flight attendant's gestures were incomplete. The words poured from her mouth in a drab, mechanical tone. If there were nervous flyers on board, it wouldn't have comforted them. Monique thought of the FAA guidelines that emphasized clear communication during safety briefings. The more she observed, the clearer it became that this crew might be coasting on routine rather than delivering safety information in a clear, attentive manner. As soon as the demonstration ended, Nigel moved down the aisle to check seatbelts. When he reached Monique's row, he glanced at her seatbelt without a word. For the woman next to Monique, he offered a brief, "all set there," but to Monique, not even a nod. It was subtle, but Monique felt it a wave of dismissal, as if her presence wasn't worth acknowledging. Inside, she steadied her emotions. She had encountered such moments before, though rarely so openly, especially while traveling. She forced herself to remain calm, reminding herself that she was on duty. Every detail mattered. The plane taxied onto the runway. The engines roared, and they began to lift off. As they climbed, Monique turned her attention to the wing flaps. She listened for the mechanical sounds and watched the angles. Everything seemed normal from that standpoint. However, that uneasy feeling lingered, a tone in the cabin that suggested the flight attendants were on edge, or perhaps their real personalities were overshadowed by their friction with certain passengers. Once the seatbelt sign switched off, the attendants began the beverage service. Laura pushed a cart down the aisle, offering water, soda, coffee, or tea. When she reached Monique's row, she served the middle seat passenger first, completely normal. Then she asked the window seat occupant, which was Monique, "Would you like something to drink?" Monique requested water. The attendant poured water into a plastic cup, placed it on her tray table, and quickly moved on to the next row. "No. Here you go. No, enjoy your flight. Not even a smile." She might have dismissed it as a flight attendant having a bad day, but the passenger behind her, the one who had just asked for water, received a friendly comment about how the Chicago weather is going to be lovely this weekend. Monique noticed how the flight attendant interacted with passengers who didn't look like her. The older woman in the aisle seat, who was white, received far more warmth and conversation. Another passenger behind them, who was white, got jokes about the turbulence. But every time Laura engaged with Monique, her words were clipped or absent. Monique let it go. She took a sip of water, mentally logging the difference in treatment. She had to gather a substantial record of observations. A single rude moment could be chalked up to an attendant having an off day. A pattern, however, meant something deeper was at play. Monique's mind wandered to the instructions she'd received back at the FAA's offices in Washington, D.C. While the FAA often sends inspectors openly, brandishing credentials, this flight was part of a more specialized program to root out patterns of subtle bias and poor adherence to safety protocols. Specifically, they were looking into how flight crews responded to passengers from diverse backgrounds. Monique, both African American and female, represented a demographic that had filed a number of recent complaints. Her performance metrics and experience made her an ideal candidate for this covert operation. Before becoming an inspector, Monique had earned her pilot's license and worked for years in flight operations. She knew exactly what details to look for, from how emergency equipment was stowed to how the crew handled rowdy passengers or those with special requests. So far, she had documented unsmiling interactions, cut corners in the safety demo, and tension among the flight attendants. These might seem small, but they were puzzle pieces that could form a bigger picture. As the flight reached cruising altitude, turbulence struck. It started as a light rattle, but then the plane jolted more aggressively, causing overhead bins to rattle. Passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign blinked back on with a ding, and a firm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Monique felt the plane's adjustments. The nose tilted slightly as the pilot tried to navigate a smoother altitude. She placed her hand on the seat in front to steady herself against the shaking. This level of turbulence was not uncommon, but the abruptness suggested perhaps the crew hadn't been adequately warned, or they failed to pass on warnings to the passengers. In the row ahead, a nervous flyer clutched the armrests. She pressed the call button, presumably needing reassurance. Nigel walked over, forced a tight smile, and told her to remain calm, but his explanation of the turbulence was vague and hurried. He moved on swiftly, ignoring the woman's pleading glance for a bit more comfort. Yet, for the man in the aisle seat next to her, who had a silver membership tag on his carry-on bag, Nigel lingered to chat amiably about frequent flyer points, city hotspots in Chicago, and a new lounge opening. The difference in his demeanor was stark. Monique's frustration built. It wasn't just about her, it was about how systematically certain passengers were treated with warmth, while others were practically brushed off. Clearly, the flight attendants favored those they deemed more important or more like them. Once the turbulence subsided, passengers scattered to use the restrooms. Monique felt a tug of empathy when she saw a young black mother with an infant heading to the lavatory. The flight attendant Laura intercepted the woman curtly, telling her to be quick because others might need to use the lavatory too. The mother looked flustered, juggling her diaper bag and the crying baby. Monique kept an eye on the situation. The mother tried to change the infant's diaper in that tiny lavatory space, only to discover the changing table was flimsy. She opened the door a crack and asked if there was another restroom with a better setup. Laura sighed loudly, rolling her eyes before snapping, "We only have these lavatories, ma'am." Her tone carried annoyance, not an ounce of empathy. The mother hurriedly finished changing her baby. As she emerged, Laura pursed her lips and said nothing more. By contrast, just 10 minutes earlier, an older man had spilled coffee on himself and asked for help. Laura had jumped into action, providing napkins and fussing over him apologetically, even though it was the passenger's own spill. Monique's anger simmered. If she intervened or confronted the behavior now, it might blow her cover. She had to maintain composure, keep documenting, and complete her mission. An hour into the flight, a different flight attendant named Jennifer took over beverage refills and trash collection. Jennifer was short, with curly brown hair and a bright, genuine smile. When she reached Monique's row, she politely asked, "Would you like some more water or a different beverage?" Monique asked for orange juice, and Jennifer promptly handed her a cup. "Everything all right so far?" Jennifer asked, more earnestly than anyone else had. Monique nodded. She gave Jennifer a small smile, feeling a spark of human warmth. She didn't reveal her role, of course, but she noted that Jennifer's approach was significantly different from Laura's and Nigel's. Jennifer then noticed the mother with the baby across the aisle. The infant was still fussy. Jennifer offered to warm a bottle, and it made the mother's eyes light up in gratitude. As Jennifer moved down the aisle, Monique felt a tinge of relief. At least one member of the cabin crew seemed to remember that compassion and empathy were part of the job. Mid-flight, while most passengers were dozing or watching in-flight entertainment, Monique decided to stretch her legs. She walked toward the back galley, passing rows of half-asleep travelers. The faint hum of the engines and the gentle sway of the cabin accompanied her. She found the rear galley empty, except for the younger flight attendant she had noticed earlier, the one who looked uncertain when Nigel had given instructions. Her name tag read Sandra. She had a petite frame and looked up from rummaging in a cabinet. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice subdued. "I just wanted to walk around a bit," Monique said. "Mind if I stand here for a moment?" Sandra gave an awkward smile. "Sure, but the seatbelt sign might come on if we hit turbulence again." Monique nodded. "I'll keep an eye out." Sandra busied herself with rearranging plastic cups. In a hushed tone, she suddenly asked, "How's the flight for you so far?" Monique answered carefully, "It's all right." "Is everything okay with the crew?" Sandra's shoulders tensed. She looked like she wanted to speak but thought better of it. The pause lingered until finally she said in a low voice, "It's been stressful. Our lead is going through some personal stuff, and we're short-staffed, that's all." Monique recognized the universal sign of an employee who wanted to confide but was unsure if it was safe. Before she could ask more, the curtain shifted and Nigel appeared. He glanced at Monique, then at Sandra, and said, "Sandra, the first need you up front." He didn't spare Monique more than a fleeting glance, one that dripped with silent suspicion. Sandra quickly grabbed her notepad and scurried up the aisle. Monique returned to her seat. It was clear there was tension among the crew, and it was affecting their professionalism. Still, that didn't fully explain why some passengers were treated with courtesy and others were practically ghosts. Monique made a note to observe further. In the next few hours, the subtleties continued. Flight attendants mostly bypassed Monique when handing out snacks unless she specifically asked. They didn't check on her comfort, whereas they checked on others. She watched Laura chat casually with passengers who looked affluent or who matched her demographic: white, well-dressed, or frequent flyers. A few times, Laura made eye contact with Monique, but gave her a dismissive nod, if that. Every time, Monique reminded herself not to react emotionally. She was here to document, not to pick a fight. If she made a scene, she risked being labeled a troublemaker, which could compromise her official mission. She mentally went through the FAA codes, recalling the responsibilities of flight attendants to ensure safety, treat all passengers with respect, attend to needs without discrimination, and maintain a calm environment. She felt a pang of disappointment that such guidelines were being overlooked. She thought of the smaller airlines that took great pride in community and personal service, or the big airlines that hammered home the importance of courtesy and empathy. Jetstream Air, at least on this flight, seemed to have missed the memo. With about an hour left in the flight, the captain announced they might hit another pocket of turbulence while descending into Chicago. Monique tuned in to see how the attendants would handle this. If they were ignoring her because of racial bias, would they also ignore emergency procedures? Sure enough, Nigel and Laura did the bare minimum. They walked the aisles, ensuring tray tables were up and seat backs straight. But when it came to addressing the nervous woman 2 rows ahead, who was visibly trembling, they offered no reassurance. The mother with the baby asked if she should hold her infant in a certain way for landing. Nigel just shrugged and said, "Just follow the instructions in the safety card." Meanwhile, a businessman in row 8 got a full explanation about how the seatbelt sign worked and what to expect during landing. Monique recorded each incident in her mind with meticulous care. She also paid close attention to the overhead compartments, ensuring none were about to pop open mid-descent. She noticed a slight hum in the ventilation system, perhaps a minor mechanical quirk, but nothing alarming. Still, the flight crew's attitude worried her more than any mechanical noise. She had the power, in her official capacity, to flag these issues in her final report, which could lead to investigations, possible fines, or mandatory retraining. But that would come later. For now, she had to endure. The plane touched down at Chicago O'Hare with a thud, the wheels hitting the runway harder than usual. Passengers jolted in their seats, breath catching in their throats. The overhead lights flickered momentarily. Monique felt the plane sway slightly before stabilizing. As they taxied to the gate, relief washed over the cabin in the form of collective exhales and the rustle of passengers getting their belongings ready. Nigel came on the intercom with the usual, "Welcome to Chicago. We hope you enjoyed your flight." But his voice lacked sincerity, sounding like a machine spitting out memorized lines. Monique wondered how many other people felt the same undercurrent of dismissal and tension she had. Or perhaps they were too focused on their own travels to notice. Upon disembarking, the mother with the baby struggled with her carry-on and the infant in her arms. Laura stood at the door to say goodbye to passengers. When the mother approached, Laura simply turned her head to greet someone else, offering the mother no assistance. By contrast, the man who followed, a well-dressed executive, received a wide smile and an enthusiastic, "Have a nice day!" Monique walked past Nigel and Laura, offering a polite nod. Nigel said nothing in return. Laura gave a cursory "take care," but avoided eye contact. Monique was still incognito, so there was no reason for them to treat her with extra courtesy. But the basic standards of customer service were lacking. Once off the plane, Monique merged into the crowd heading toward baggage claim. The tension in her chest began to ease. She felt a mix of anger and resolve. Part of her wanted to confront the crew right away, to say, "You have no idea who I am or what authority I hold over your entire operation." But that wasn't her style or her assignment. She had to remain discreet. However, she would ensure that the final report reflected every instance of negligence and bias she had witnessed. That evening, Monique checked into a nearby Chicago hotel. She had arranged a meeting the next morning with her FAA contact to discuss her observations. She spent the night typing up her notes on her laptop, meticulously recounting every exchange, every ignored question, every subtle slight. A soft knock on her door startled her just after she finished emailing a preliminary summary to her supervisor. It was unexpected. She didn't know anyone in Chicago personally, and she hadn't ordered room service. She looked through the peephole and saw a familiar face, Jennifer, the kind flight attendant. Shocked, she opened the door. Jennifer looked nervous, her expression laced with embarrassment. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I saw you in the lobby earlier. I recognized you from the flight. Could I talk to you for a moment?" Monique let her in, her mind racing. Had she been identified? Jennifer seemed flustered. "I'm not supposed to do this, but I noticed how you were treated on the flight. I saw how Nigel and Laura acted, and I wanted to apologize. It isn't right." Monique quickly reassured Jennifer. "I appreciate that. You didn't have to come here." Jennifer hesitated, wringing her hands. "Something's off with this crew, especially Nigel and Laura. They have certain prejudices. Even Sandra gets bullied by them." She's just too scared to say anything. It's been creating a terrible atmosphere on the plane. I saw how they neglected you and that young mother, and I can't just keep quiet about it." Monique listened carefully, her heart pounding. This was exactly the kind of internal testimony that could confirm her observations, but she had to tread carefully and maintain her cover. "I'm just a passenger. Why are you telling me this?" Jennifer shook her head. "I can't explain it, I just felt compelled. You seemed so calm. You never complained or asked to speak to a supervisor, even though you had every right to. I guess I just wanted you to know that not all of us are like them." Monique offered Jennifer a chair. "You should consider reporting this to your management or the FAA." Jennifer sighed. "Management turns a blind eye. Nigel has a good track record with sales and upselling seats. Laura is well liked by the higher-ups for her longevity. I'm the newbie. If I speak up, I'm afraid I'll lose my job." Monique felt torn. She wanted to reassure Jennifer that the FAA took such complaints seriously, but she also didn't want to blow her cover yet. If something truly violates regulation, it's your right to report it confidentially. Jennifer nodded, tears brimming. "Thanks for listening. I'm sorry to disturb you. I just needed to clear my conscience. I'll let you rest now." Before Jennifer left, Monique placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing by speaking up, at least in a small way. Take care of yourself." Jennifer left, looking marginally relieved. Monique closed the door, a swirl of emotions in her chest. This was more than just a single flight with a grumpy crew. There was a culture at play, a culture that allowed prejudice, favoritism, and disregard for certain passengers. She knew that her final report would be lengthy, but it might not change the hearts of people like Nigel and Laura. Yet, even if it led to mandated training or reassignments, that would be a start. The next morning, Monique met her FAA contact, Felix Ramos, in a small conference room at the FAA's Chicago field office. Felix was a seasoned investigator with graying temples and keen eyes. He greeted Monique warmly and offered her coffee. "How was the flight?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Monique's jaw tightened. "Worse than anticipated. There's definitely an issue with the crew's attitude. Bias, negligence of certain passengers, and minimal adherence to some safety procedures." Felix nodded gravely. "We've had sporadic complaints about Jetstream Air's cabin crew practices, but we needed proof. This flight was a test run for a deeper look. I need details." Monique handed him a typed report, along with a digital file containing her notes. She explained the pattern, how Nigel and Laura were polite and chatty with some passengers while ignoring or being brusque with black passengers or those who seemed less affluent. She recounted the rushed safety demonstration, the minimal responses to safety concerns, and Jennifer's late-night visit, which confirmed the toxic dynamic on board. Felix skimmed through her report, his brow furrowed. "This is serious. The FAA can fine the airline or mandate retraining, but it depends on how high this goes. If it's just 2 attendants, that's one thing. If the entire management culture tolerates it, that's another." Monique nodded, tension swirling in her gut. "We need to find out if this is an isolated incident or systemic. I believe Jennifer's testimony points to a deeper problem, but she's scared to come forward." Felix placed the papers in a neat pile. "We might have to schedule another inspection unannounced. Your account is thorough. We'll compile everything and send it to the relevant department. For now, consider your part done. You'll receive an update soon." Monique stood to leave, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She had done her duty, and the FAA would handle the next steps. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the crew might get wind of the investigation and continue harming unsuspecting passengers. She wanted resolution and, frankly, a dose of karma to remind them that no one is above treating others with basic human decency. A week later, Monique received a surprising assignment. She was asked to conduct a second covert inspection on the same airline, Jetstream Air, but a different route this time, from Chicago O'Hare to Denver International. This was unusual so soon after her first mission, but evidently the FAA wanted to compare experiences. When she arrived at the gate, her heart sank. The flight attendant staffing Flight 913 to Denver included the same lead, Nigel, and the same senior attendant, Laura. Jennifer wasn't there, nor was Sandra, but fate had placed Monique once again in the path of the very crew she had flagged for misconduct. Wearing different attire this time, a beige blouse and black slacks, Monique checked in. She wondered if Nigel or Laura would recognize her. After all, she was just another passenger, and they saw hundreds a day, but she was also a tall, poised black woman. They might remember her. As she approached the boarding door, Nigel was busy on a phone call. Laura glanced at Monique, squinted a bit as if trying to place her, but then gave a quick look at the next passenger. Monique let out a silent exhale. So far, so good she was still invisible. On board, the mood was eerily similar. Nigel gave the announcements in the same monotone voice. Laura read the safety briefing, again rushing through it without a shred of warmth. Monique found her seat, 8C this time, near the front of the economy cabin. She noticed a couple in the row across from her, whispering and glancing at the flight attendants. They were a mixed-race couple. One partner was black, the other was white, and they looked uneasy. Monique wondered if they had already sensed something off. Not long after takeoff, the flight attendants began their service. Nigel passed by with the snack basket, handing out pretzels to the passengers in the first few rows. When he reached the mixed-race couple, he barely slowed down, placing the basket at the edge of their seat row without making eye contact. They fumbled awkwardly for the snacks. Then Nigel moved on to the row behind them, smiling and joking with a pair of young white travelers about the scenic views of Denver. Monique's stomach churned. It was the same blatant pattern of selective courtesy she had witnessed on the previous flight. The cynic in her realized they had no fear of consequences. They must have felt secure enough to continue these microaggressions. When it was Monique's turn to request a snack, Nigel didn't even meet her eye. He thrust the basket in her direction. "Pretzels or cookies?" he said flatly. "I'll have the pretzels," Monique responded quietly. He moved on without a word. The passenger seated next to Monique, a young woman in a business suit, received a polite, "Would you care for anything else, miss?" right after. Monique recorded every detail. Part of her bristled with anger at their audacity, but she kept calm. She was determined this time to see just how far this would go. About 30 minutes into the flight, an older gentleman seated diagonally across from Monique pressed the call button. He was coughing heavily, and his face appeared flushed. Laura arrived, but her approach was unhurried. "Sir, is there something you need?" she asked in an almost impatient tone. He tried to speak, but was caught in a fit of coughing. Alarmed, Monique unbuckled her seatbelt, ready to assist if needed, but stayed put for the moment to see how the crew would respond. The man's wife, seated next to him, looked frightened. Laura sighed. "Sir, if you're not feeling well, perhaps you should see a doctor when we land." He gestured for water, but his throat was too constricted to speak clearly. Laura stood there, seemingly clueless, until the wife said, "He needs water now." With a dismissive nod, Laura trotted to the galley and returned with a small cup of water. "Here," she said curtly, handing it over. There was no sense of urgency, no empathy. She didn't even offer to call for medical assistance or check if there was a doctor on board. The wife had to ask if they had extra oxygen or if they could contact the captain for help. While the coughing eventually subsided and the man stabilized, Monique was appalled. Flight attendants are trained to handle medical situations with caution and compassion. Even if it wasn't a major emergency, the casual disregard showed how complacent or indifferent Laura had become. Just as Monique considered stepping in, The wife turned to her and whispered, "Can you believe how unhelpful she is?" Monique simply shook her head, noting it all. Halfway to Denver, Monique decided that enough was enough. The crew's attitude, especially Laura's, posed a risk to passenger well-being. She considered whether she should reveal her identity mid-flight. Typically, FAA policy is to remain undercover, but if a situation threatens passenger safety, an undercover inspector has the authority to intervene. Before she could act, Nigel's voice came on the intercom. "Folks, we'll be encountering some moderate turbulence in a few minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane began to shake. The man who had been coughing earlier pressed the call button again. This time, Nigel came by. He rolled his eyes, scowling as if the passenger's need was an inconvenience. "Sir, what's wrong now?" Nigel asked flatly. The man croaked, "I need more water, please." "My throat, still not well." Nigel sighed. "You'll have to wait until the turbulence passes." "I can't be walking around if it gets choppy." Monique glanced out the window. The sky ahead looked clear. While the plane experienced a few bumps, it wasn't severe. Usually, flight attendants do try to minimize movement during turbulence, but refusing a simple request for water seemed unnecessarily harsh. At that moment, Monique's internal debate ended. The safety and comfort of passengers were at risk. She stood up, ignoring the seatbelt sign. She approached Nigel, her FAA badge discreetly tucked in her jacket pocket. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I believe the passenger is in need of water, and the turbulence is mild enough to manage. Could you please get him some?" Nigel frowned. "Ma'am, you need to sit down. The seatbelt sign is on." Monique held his gaze. "Yes, but you are required to assist a passenger in distress." "Who do you think you are, telling me my job?" Nigel snapped, raising his voice, catching the attention of nearby passengers. Monique reached into her pocket and flashed her FAA credentials just enough for Nigel to see. In a quiet but resolute tone, she said, "I'm an FAA Aviation Safety Inspector, currently conducting a covert review of this airline's in-flight procedures and conduct. And I'm instructing you to bring the passenger water now, or I'll have to report your refusal as a direct violation of your duties." Nigel's face drained of color. He stood there, stunned. Laura, who had been making her way toward them, overheard and nearly dropped the beverage tray she was carrying. Passengers nearby began to murmur, some even letting out audible gasps. With trembling hands, Nigel turned and hurried to the galley. Moments later, he returned with water and offered it to the ailing passenger, this time in near silence. Monique remained standing, watching. She could feel her own heart pounding, but she kept her composure. The tension in the cabin was palpable. It was as though the very air had turned electric with shock. Once the passenger was taken care of, Nigel leaned in close to Monique, his face twisted with anger and embarrassment. "Why didn't you tell us before? This is totally out of line." Monique stared him down. "I'm not obligated to announce my identity when conducting an inspection. Your responsibility, regardless of who is watching, is to treat passengers with respect and adhere to safety protocols." Laura appeared at Nigel's side. Her expression was a mix of panic and fury. "We could have provided better service if we'd known we were being inspected," she hissed under her breath. Monique's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly why these inspections are covert. Passengers should receive proper care and respect at all times, not just when you suspect an official is on board." Now, many passengers nearby were watching intently. Some pulled out phones, possibly recording. The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. As if in a final show of defiance, Nigel sniffed and said, "Well, you've seen us at a bad time. We're short-staffed and the turbulence is unpredictable. Don't jump to conclusions." Monique maintained her calm. "I've been on 2 flights with this airline in the last week, both under your supervision. This isn't a one-off situation, and I have plenty of documented evidence. Now, Kindly return to your duties. We will address this matter formally once on the ground. Nigel and Laura exchanged a look, then retreated up the aisle. Monique sat back down, heart pounding. She could see passengers smiling or nodding at her in gratitude. One middle-aged woman mouthed, "Thank you," from across the aisle. Monique fastened her seatbelt, took a steadying breath, and prepared herself for the aftermath. Revealing her identity mid-flight was a big step, but she'd had no choice. The well-being of that coughing passenger and the blatant disregard for safety and courtesy demanded immediate intervention. The rest of the flight proceeded in awkward silence. Nigel and Laura avoided most passenger contact, leaving another attendant who seemed just as shocked to manage basic duties. The seatbelt sign eventually turned off and mild turbulence dissipated. Everyone was waiting for the flight to land, likely anticipating fireworks upon arrival. As they approached Denver International, the captain made the landing announcement. The plane descended smoothly onto the runway. Once the engines powered down at the gate, the seatbelt sign flicked off. No one stood up immediately. It was as though they were waiting to see what would happen next. Monique stood, retrieving her bag from the overhead compartment. She stepped into the aisle, her posture confident, her face betraying no uncertainty. Nigel and Laura were near the front exit, exchanging frantic whispers. When Monique reached them, she said in a measured tone, "I expect full cooperation from you both once we deplane. FAA protocol requires a follow-up interview regarding the incidents on this flight and last week's flight. We'll meet at the gate or in a designated office." Laura's cheeks burned red. She nodded stiffly. Nigel refused to look at Monique. Passengers streamed past, some offering supportive smiles or surreptitious thumbs up to Monique as they left the aircraft. The ailing passenger thanked her profusely. His wife looked ready to burst with relief. Finally, Monique disembarked, stepping into the jet bridge. Two uniformed Jetstream Air representatives were waiting, alerted by the pilot that an FAA inspector was on board and that a serious complaint had been lodged. They invited Monique, Nigel, and Laura to a private lounge area within the terminal. In the lounge, Monique introduced herself formally and presented her FAA credentials to the airline representatives, a supervisor named Carl and a regional manager named Haley. Nigel and Laura stood to the side, their faces taut with apprehension. Carl cleared his throat. "We've received notice from the cockpit that there may have been some issues on this flight." Monique gave a succinct overview, detailing the specific incidents, the disregard for passenger comfort, the subpar safety demonstration, the differential treatment of passengers based on perceived race or status, and the mishandling of a medical concern. She also referenced her previous flight with the same crew, providing a glimpse of her documented observations. Haley's eyes widened in alarm as she listened. She immediately turned to Nigel and Laura. "Is this true?" Nigel stammered. "We did our best under difficult conditions. The flight was turbulent, and we didn't know we had an inspector on board." Laura tried to add, "We're short-staffed. It's been very stressful." Monique interjected calmly, "Stress is no excuse for discrimination or failing to follow standard procedures. Also, your behavior toward other demographics suggests you're not short on time or attention, just selective in whom you give it to." Haley and Carl exchanged looks. Haley then said, "We will have to conduct an internal investigation. It's possible we'll place you both on administrative leave pending the outcome." Nigel's jaw dropped. Laura's face twisted in panic. "You can't do that. I've been with this airline for over 10 years. I'm a senior flight attendant." Carl spoke firmly. "We have protocols, Laura. And if these allegations prove true, that seniority won't protect you from disciplinary action." Monique watched, her heart a mix of stern resolve and empathy. She didn't rejoice in seeing their fear, but she believed in accountability. My official report will be sent to both the FAA and Jetstream Air's corporate office. Additional measures, including fines or mandatory retraining, may follow. Nigel glared, eyes flashing with resentment. He looked ready to protest, but found no words. Laura seemed more desperate, as though she recognized the seriousness of what was happening. With that, the meeting ended. Carl and Haley escorted Nigel and Laura away to a separate room for immediate questioning. Monique lingered, exhaling a long breath. She reflected on how quickly the facade had crumbled once they realized who she was. A week later, Monique received an update at the FAA office. Jetstream Air had officially placed Nigel and Laura on unpaid leave pending further investigation. There were also rumors that the airline's management considered dismissing them for cause, especially after reviewing passenger complaints from the 2 flights. Moreover, the FAA was issuing a warning to Jetstream Air, mandating that the entire cabin crew system-wide go through diversity training and a refresher on safety and emergency protocols. A fine was also being considered, contingent on the final review of Monique's reports and any additional passenger testimonies. Monique felt a sense of closure. She knew that while these measures might not instantly eradicate bias, they were a start. Real change would take consistent effort, but at least for now, the airline and the specific crew members were held accountable. Weeks turned into a month. Monique heard through the grapevine that Nigel had hired a lawyer trying to dispute the claims. But with multiple passenger statements and Monique's official testimony, he had little ground to stand on. Laura apparently tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding. The airline, however, had zero tolerance once confronted with documented evidence of discriminatory behavior and safety lapses. Jennifer, the kind flight attendant, reached out to Monique via email after the news broke internally. She thanked Monique, writing, "Things are changing on our flights. The atmosphere is different. Management is actually listening to us. Thank you for doing what I was too scared to do." Reading that email warmed Monique's heart. She responded with a brief note of encouragement, reminding Jennifer to keep standing up for what's right. 3 months later, Monique found herself traveling again, this time for personal reasons. She had a family reunion in Atlanta and booked a last minute flight on Jetstream Air. She was curious to see if any changes had truly taken root. When she boarded, she was greeted by a bright-eyed flight attendant who smiled genuinely. "Welcome aboard. May I help you find your seat?" Her name tag read Sandra, the same junior attendant who had once looked so timid. Now, she seemed more self-assured. Monique accepted the help, noticing how Sandra also went out of her way to assist an elderly woman struggling with her carry-on. She walked down the aisle, saw Jennifer serving drinks with that same friendly warmth, and observed a new lead flight attendant, an older man named Mark, kindly guiding a group of anxious first-time flyers. The energy was palpably different. When Sandra recognized Monique, her eyes flickered in surprise. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then just smiled. They shared a silent understanding. Things had changed, and Monique had played a part in that transformation. As the plane soared above the clouds, Monique stared out the window, reflecting on her journey. She remembered that first flight, how invisible she felt, how poorly certain passengers were treated. She recalled the second flight, the medical scare, and revealing her identity. Then the cascade of consequences. It hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. Looking around, she saw flight attendants calmly helping passengers, checking seatbelts, and giving clear instructions. Sandra's voice came over the intercom, explaining the arrival procedures with care and a hint of pride. It was a dramatic shift from what Monique had experienced just months earlier. Karma had indeed delivered a blow to those who treated passengers with bias and disdain. The airline had been forced to confront the problem, and in the end, not only were Nigel and Laura held accountable, but the entire culture of the company seemed to be moving toward genuine improvement. Monique allowed herself a small smile as she realized how one person's determination and the backing of a powerful agency like the FAA could expose wrongdoing, create ripple effects, and inspire better treatment for all. This story reminds us that injustice can persist until someone steps in to challenge it head-on. When Monique chose to reveal her role as an FAA aviation safety inspector, she shattered the walls of apathy and prejudice within that flight crew. Her covert missions, thorough documentation, and unyielding sense of responsibility led to accountability for Nigel and Laura. More importantly, it sparked a cultural shift in how Jetstream Air treated its passengers regardless of background or status. If you found yourself cheering for Monique, or if her story resonated with your sense of fairness, help spread the word. Share this video, hit that like button, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories. By doing so, you become part of a community committed to unveiling hidden truths and standing against discrimination. Together, let's ensure that everyone, no matter who they are, is treated with dignity and respect in the skies and beyond.